Base rate fallacy. Imagine hearing that your friend is extremely shy and reserved. You might assume they are more likely to be a librarian than a salesperson. However, since there are significantly more salespeople than librarians overall, statistically speaking, your friend is actually more likely to be a salesperson. This happens because we tend to overlook the base rate, how common something is in the general population, and instead focus on specific details that match our expectations. Conjunction fallacy. Suppose I tell you that Mr. JN had a heart attack. Now consider these two statements. Mr. JN had a heart attack. Mr. JN had a heart attack, and he is over 60 years old. If you think the second statement is more likely to be true, because heart attacks are more common in older individuals, you've fallen into the conjunction fallacy. Reality, the probability of two events occurring together, can never be greater than the probability of just one event happening. Masked man fallacy. This fallacy stems from a misunderstanding of identity logic. If you know a person in one context but don't recognize them in another, it doesn't mean they are two different people. For example, if you don't realize that Clark Kent is Superman, you might incorrectly conclude that Superman and Clark Kent are different individuals based on your knowledge, rather than the actual facts. Moving the goalpost. This occurs when someone continuously changes the criteria for proving a point, making it nearly impossible to meet the demands. For instance, if you show evidence to support your argument and the other person dismisses it by demanding even more evidence, and then even more, they are shifting the goalpost to avoid admitting they were wrong. Hot hand fallacy. This is the belief that past success in a random event increases the chances of success in future attempts. It's especially common in sports like basketball, where a player who has made several consecutive shots is assumed to have a hot hand and is expected to keep scoring. Whether this is a real phenomenon or just a cognitive bias is still debated. Existential fallacy. This happens when an argument assumes that a category has actual members when it does not. For example, if someone says, "All trespassers will be prosecuted," and then concludes that some of those prosecuted must be trespassers, they are assuming that trespassers actually exist, even though the original statement never established that fact. The Tan-Bailey fallacy. This rhetorical trick involves making a controversial claim but retreating to a much more defensible, reasonable claim when challenged. Then, once the challenge is gone, the person switches back to the original extreme position. Affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. This formal fallacy occurs when a logical argument includes a negative premise but still arrives at a positive conclusion. For example, saying "no fish can fly," and "some dogs are not fish, therefore some dogs can fly," is an incorrect logical leap. Definitional retreat. This fallacy happens when someone changes the meaning of a word to avoid being proven wrong. For example, if someone claims real gamers play every day and is then shown evidence of pro players who DNT, they might redefine real gamer to mean something else entirely. Post hoc fallacy. This is the mistaken belief that if one event follows another, the first must have caused the second. Just because event A happened before event B doesn't mean a caused B could be mere coincidence. Persuasive definition. A persuasive definition disguises itself as a neutral explanation, but actually carries a biased viewpoint. For instance, calling organic food healthy and safe in an advertisement subtly implies that non-organic food is neither. Feedback fallacy. This occurs when we assume feedback is always objective and useful, without considering that the person giving it may have biases, personal interests, or limited perspective. Homunculus fallacy. This is when an explanation simply restates the concept instead of actually explaining it. For example, saying thought is generated by a little thinker inside the brain doesn't explain anything, it just shifts the question to how does the little thinker think. If buy a whiskey fallacy, this tactic allows someone to appear to agree with both sides of an issue by being deliberately vague. Politicians often use this to appeal to multiple groups without taking a clear stance. Loaded label fallacy. This involves using emotionally charged words to make a claim seem more convincing. For example, calling a political policy a Freedom Act implies it promotes freedom, even if it actually restricts liberties. Kettle logic. This fallacy occurs when someone uses multiple arguments to support their point, but those arguments contradict each other. Lump of labor fallacy. This mistaken belief assumes there's a fixed amount of work available, so reducing work hours must create more jobs. In reality, job availability fluctuates based on multiple economic factors. McNamara fallacy, relying only on measurable statistics while ignoring qualitative factors, leads to flawed conclusions. Just because something can't be quantified doesn't mean it's unimportant. Mind projection fallacy. This happens when someone assumes their personal perception of the world is objective reality. People often project their own beliefs onto external facts without realizing their biases. Package deal fallacy. This occurs when someone assumes that things commonly grouped together must always stay together. Just because two ideas are traditionally linked doesn't mean they are inseparable. Correlation versus causation fallacy. Just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. For example, ice cream sales and drowning incidents both increase in summer, but ice cream doesn't cause drowning. Gambler's fallacy. This is the mistaken belief that past random events influence future random events. In gambling, for instance, a player might think a losing streak means a win is due soon, but that's not how probability works. Argument from silence. Assuming something is false just because there's no record of it is flawed reasoning. The absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Appeal to motive, dismissing an argument based on the speaker's motives, rather than addressing their actual points. Just because someone has an agenda doesn't mean their argument is automatically wrong. Relative privation fallacy. This happens when someone dismisses a concern by saying there are bigger problems in the world. While true, it doesn't mean the smaller issue isn't worth discussing.